Welcome to the second in our series of Tea and Talks with myself, Owen Smith. Today we are joined with local resident Martin Fairhurst. So thank you, Martin, for joining us here on this Sunday. How are you?
I'm fine, and it's a pleasure to join you.
So, how is your lockdown going?
Reasonably well. I seem to be able to get sufficient food. I live at Ganshill. Luckily, there is a baker's there that always seems to produce bread, and the local Sainsbury's, a small one, seems to have most of the things I want. So, I'm reasonably happy.
Good. It's good to
I'm very good on countdown.
I can imagine you'll only get better by the end of this as well at it. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, Martin?
The suggestion that seemed to be beforehand that maybe I could talk about my upbringing in Ilford. Yeah. In fact, I wasn't brought up in Ilford. I didn't come to Ilford until I was in my 20s.
Right.
I was actually born in Bolton, in Lancashire, in 1939. My parents were missionaries, Methodist missionaries in French West Africa, Dahomey and the Ivory Coast. I was born in Bolton. My mother stayed at home, and my father went back to French West Africa. He only got home just before, on apparently the last boat before France fell in the war, because it was a French dependency and so on. So he got home, and for the rest of his life, he was in England, and I certainly never went to Africa. But yes, I was born in Bolton. My mother had a Kodak Cine film camera, and my father had the projector in Africa. So she would take films of me, send them off presumably by post to Africa, so Dad could see me.
How lovely.
And eventually he came back on the last boat before France fell. And from that time onwards, he was a minister in various churches in the UK. Incidentally, it's quite interesting that the word furlough, which suddenly seems to appeared from nowhere, was always associated in my mind with missionaries.
Oh, really?
A missionary came home on furlough. And suddenly, whatever it is, 50 years later, 60 years later, it's become a word that apparently is being used to explain how people can be off work and get paid or something like that.
It is.
Which I suppose was up. Ministers were paid a stipend, not a wage.
Right.
And a furlough allowed them to continue to be paid their stipend whilst they had a rest, I suppose, at home, and then went back. I have a few mementos of their time in Africa. Apparently, there was something like 4 or 5 large packing cases that were supposed to find their way back from Africa to us in England, or to my parents in England. Only one ever arrived. Otherwise, we might have had some Benin heads or something like that. But I have got, for instance, this. It doesn't show up very well in. Where are we?
Oh yeah.
If I shed the lights, it's up here. I forget where the camera is on this. Anyhow, that's not very good, but it's that's where the camera is. It's a carved ivory head, so it's not.
Right.
I got 1 or 2 ivory items which I obviously can't sell, even if I wanted to, but I wouldn't want to. But it's I've got a few things like that from Africa.
Were they ever based anywhere else, or just Africa?
Just French West Africa, the Dahomey and the Ivory Coast, which aren't next to each other. There's another, I think, a British dependency in between on the West African coast, a bit further west than the Congo and that sort of area, I think.
So what brought you to Redbridge then eventually?
I went to school in Canterbury, to a boarding school in Kent, because by then my parents had moved down to Dartford and then Maidstone, and they ended up in Sidcup. After school, I went to college in Stepney, Queen Mary, and lived in Stepney for, I suppose, 3 or 4 years eventually got married, and we acquired our first house in Kingston Road off Ilford Lane.
Right.
Being affordable and with a GLC very low percentage mortgage as they were at that particular time. And we went to worship at the Methodist Church too, which is just up the road on Ilford Lane. And at the time I was working for a computer company. I've always had a sort of background of technical subjects, I did maths and physics at school and that sort of thing at college. Yeah, we moved to Kingston Road, stayed there for about 7 years, I think. As I say, yes, I was working for a computer company in those days called Borough, later became Unisys.
Oh, right.
In those days they weren't computers. Computers were magic, generations away from most people. They were electromechanical accounting machines, that sort of thing. And by the time I left them, of course, computers were everywhere. I was working mostly with document processing equipment, the sort of equipment that sorts checks and documents for banks, that sort of thing. Bits of paper moving around so fast that if they're moving it faster, they catch fire, that sort of stuff.
So you started off in Redbridge when you first came here. You started off just off Ilford Lane. Where did you go after that?
Up to Gants Hill, Gaysham Avenue.
Oh, right.
Where I am at this very moment.
Oh.
I've not moved very much over the years. We moved up here, I think largely because my daughter was going to go to Deary's school, which is just down the road, the junior school as it was in those days. Well, it still is.
Yeah.
And eventually she went to I think the first year that Valentine's High School actually became a comprehensive, because previous to that it was the girls' grammar school.
I always remember, because I grew up in Newbury Park, and I remember my nan used to take us for treats to the Odeon Cinema at Gants Hill.
Oh, yes, no longer there.
Beautiful building.
Yeah, yes, no, that's gone, of course.
Yeah.
And so has the Beehive pub just across the road.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, that's gone. It all changes. There's some interesting Facebook pages of pictures of Gants Hill over the years, and I don't recognise any of the shops, even though I must have seen them. They're all the buildings are more or less the same, but everything else has changed.
Now you're quite heavily involved with the hospital chapel, aren't you?
Yes. Well, one of the things when I worked full time for I think about 5 years, and that brought me up to retirement age, and there were then a couple of years which I continued to work for them part-time. So that, I thought, gave me lots of spare time to do all sorts of wonderful things. I don't think it quite turns out like that, but so I phoned the secretary of the Friends of the Hospital Chapel, offered my services as a volunteer. Of course, they said yes, as one does. And so, yeah, from that point on, I got quite involved, mostly in terms of first learning, obviously, about the history of the chapel and so on, and then doing guided tours with people like Peter Foley, Peter Wright. There were people they're all no longer with us, but they were real proper historians. I've never been a historian as such, and say my interest tends to be background tends to be scientific engineering, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But got involved with the chapel. I also joined things like the Ilford Historical Society, and I've always been interested in local history wherever I've been, and the chapel seemed an ideal place to go.
It's funny, isn't it? Because I think there'll be many people actually within Redbridge that doesn't actually realise that the hospital chapel, one, exists, and also that it's actually the oldest building in Ilford and Redbridge.
That's right. Yeah, yes. Quite a lot of people do know about it and say, yes, I've seen it from the top of the bus every day, because we've got a high brick wall along the front. They've never been in, partly because we don't have a lot of open days when they can. We used to have an open day once a month, but I'm afraid because of lack of volunteers, it tends now to be once every 2 months, plus the open house weekend in September. So we only sort of have March, May, July, and then September when we have open days on the second Saturday of each month. One of the aims of the Friends is to try and make sure that people in and around Redbridge and anywhere else know the existence of the chapel. And it's amazing how many people come in and say, oh, I've never been in, I've often wanted to get in, or I didn't know about it. It's,
where would people find out about the open days when they come about?
We have a website, obviously, they can look at that. We used to be able to rely on the Ilford Recorder to do things. They had different ways of doing it. Sometimes in the earlier days, it was just a little paragraph somewhere in the paper. And then for a year or two, they had a sort of 2-page spread of community events in the borough.
You see, I was introduced to the hospital chapel through the lovely Barbara Hills.
I mean, I should have mentioned that, of course. Barbara Hills was secretary of the Friends of the Hospital Chapel. At the same time, she was everything at the Kenneth More, if you like. So, you know, I got to know her quite well. And one of the things that I've tended to do over the years, as well as being involved with things like the Hospital Chapel, is going to events, plays, opera at the Kenneth More.
Oh, really?
I mean, Edna Graham's days, for me, I'm a great opera fan, tend to go to the English National Opera an awful lot. And for a while, Edna Graham put on virtually all the Mozart operas over a period of 2 or 3 years until the money ran out, basically.
So coming back to the hospital chapel, can you give us a little bit about the history of it?
I mean, almost the first thing to say is there is no hospital. There never has been a hospital. You have to think hospice, almshouse, sheltered housing, something like that, because it was founded in the 12th century, 1145 thereabouts, by the Abbess of Barking. Barking, of course, really until Ilford began to grow and the railways came, Barking was the centre of the parish of the Abbey. Barking Abbey stretched from the River Thames up to Barking side of the forest, with the river Roding on its western side and out into Chadwell Heath and Dagenham and so on. That was where everything happened from. The Abbey, together with its parish church, St Margaret's, the parish church which still exists in Barking, St Margaret's that was where the villagers went, if you like. The Abbey was for the nuns. The Abbey itself had been founded back in the 7th century, but it got destroyed by the Vikings, by the Danes, in the 8th, 9th century, and eventually was restarted as a Benedictine Abbey for nuns only. The original Abbey apparently had both men and women in it, but separate, of course. It became an Abbey for nuns only, always with an abbess in charge. Very important person, usually came from either a royal or certainly a noble family. Probably brought quite a nice dowry into the Abbey when she came with her. And she possibly wasn't actually in the Abbey all that much because she had to be wherever the monarch was. She was part of the monarch's council, the king's council, or the Abbey continued. And in 1145, the abbess at the time, a lady called Adelicia, decided that she would found really a hospice for 13 old and infirm gentlemen. Basically, what became what we call the hospital chapel.
Right.
For some reason, she chose to put it a mile away from the Abbey, where it is on Ilford Hill. Whether that was to keep the old men out from underneath her ladies' skirts, or because she thought it would be a useful marker on the road from London. Ilford Hill and the line of Ilford Hill through Ilford is part of the old Roman road, line more or less of the Roman road from London out to Chelmsford and Colchester. And it was also the point at which you had to come to if you were going to turn south and go to Barking Abbey. If you got to somewhere like Stratford, you might very well have been able to see the Abbey across the fields.
Yeah.
But you still had to cross the Roding somewhere, and it would have been a much wider, much more marshy, much more difficult terrain to cross. So you basically came up to the Roding cross the river Roding there either with a ford or a bridge, depending when it was. Came up Ilford Hill. The abbess would probably have said, pop in and have a cup of tea with the old men. And then you turned right and went down the line of what is now Ilford Lane. And a mile or so later, you'd be at the Abbey.
Right.
And all sorts of important people went to Barking Abbey, royals and so on. King William, William the First, stayed at Barking Abbey on the evenings before he was crowned king in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day in 1066. And he was just one of the important people who'd been there. Anyhow, Adelicia decided she would found this hospice for the 13 old and infirm. I mean, 13's an odd number. We wouldn't set up anything with 13 numbers these days, but in those days, 13 seems to have been a much more happy number, if you like.
Yeah.
Possibly because in terms of the Last Supper, there was Jesus and the 12 disciples round the table, 13.
Yeah.
So there is the reredos in the east end of the chapel shows it's very much a copy of the well-known Last Supper picture. Yeah. Judas is disappearing with a bag of money in his hand out the corner of the reredos. She set up the 13 old, maybe lucky if they were in their 20s, 30s, 40s, but certainly didn't live to the sort of age that we expect to reach. And infirm, well, virtually everybody was infirm in those days. You worked in, what you did was work in the fields, which were dangerous. You got broken bones. Everybody had some underlying illness. We don't view the past with rose-tinted spectacles. Certainly, if we exclude the current coronavirus, living in these days is far better than anything, even a century ago. Mm. Everybody had illnesses and all sorts of things, and that's anyhow. It was set up for these 13 men. I think it must have been a good thing to happen to somebody if you were admitted here, because you would have had companionship, care, food, warmth, shelter, that sort of thing. The other alternative, particularly if you didn't have a family, any family members left, was somehow trying to survive out on the muddy fields around the areas. Mm. And of course, it was part of the responsibility of abbeys and monasteries and so on to care for the traveller, to care for the sick, for the disadvantaged. So, that was, Adelicia set this up as part of her responsibility, I suppose. She appointed a general manager called the Master to look after the hospice. He had probably some sort of house of his own, or well, it would have been probably a wooden building of some sort or another, but and 3 clergymen, 3 priests to look after the 13 old men. They would probably have had some sort of building of their own, the 3 priests, and then there would have been some sort of building for the brethren to live in. But most importantly, too, there would have been a chapel. It was a religious setup, so you had a chapel. And although the master's house and the brethren's house and the priest's house would probably be wood, you built the chapel of the best material you could afford and lay your hands on. So you built it of stone, even if it meant bringing the stone across the river from Dartford, Kentish ragstone, something like that. And basically, she built a chapel which is a rectangular box, more or less the rectangle that is the current building. The Victorians added a south aisle, so that obviously is far newer. But the basic building and certainly the north wall of the chapel are still part of that original 12th century building. And I always like to think there was probably either a fence or a hedge around the whole area, not to keep the old boys in, but to stop the wild boar and the wolves and so on, which were in the Great Essex Forest, which came right down to the Ilford High Road, plus footpads, thieves and so on. It wasn't a nice world out there. So in there you have, once through the fence, you have the advantage of care and warmth and safety. There was always no meds. It wasn't a hospital in any way, because they probably had herbs and so on, but basically they didn't have any medical care as such. You may have heard it also referred to as the leper hospice or the leper chapel.
There seems to be a bit of argument on that history-wise, doesn't there?
Yeah, they certainly did admit lepers for a couple of centuries. When leprosy was prevalent in the sort of Middle Ages, 13th, 14th century, then lepers were admitted to the hospice. Still men only. If you came in as a leper, pardon me, you never ever went out through the gates again. You were in there for the rest of your life. Mm. And apparently they read the burial service over you because you were regarded as being dead to the world.
Really?
But even so, being admitted there, again with care and warmth and companionship and so on. But eventually leprosy died out in the UK. I gather it's related to TB in some way or other.
Yes.
And TB became the sort of
malevolent. Yeah.
Yeah, or the major problem around. So it's still talked about as a leper chapel, but that was a long time ago.
How are churches and chapels and that finding the current climate at the moment, especially as being the main port of call for people, especially in times of need and worry? They've always been a place to congregate to and seek solace. But of course, at the moment, congregation isn't really possible.
Certainly, most of the churches or groups of churches are putting something online in some way or other, whether it's just a document which suggests prayers and hymns that you might at least read, even if you don't sing the words. Other churches actually film, probably using Zoom, just like this, a service. There'll only be two people there, the vicar and somebody else, or the minister and someone else. But they will do obviously a shortened type of service, but it's there are lots of them on the internet. Certainly in the Methodist circuit, which in this area is all the Methodist churches in Barking, Dagenham and Ilford, or Redbridge. We get emails during the week telling us of links to one or other of the churches that will be doing a service, which will be put together by one or other of the ministers that we have in the circuit. And I assume very much similar things will happen in the Anglican Church. The hospital chapel is a little bit of a one-off because there aren't any Sunday services. As I say, you're supposed to be in your parish church on a Sunday, but there always has been a Thursday lunchtime communion service, Eucharist service, every Thursday, taken by the chaplain, Father Martin. Of course, that's also stopped at the moment. Mm. There aren't any of those. But because you have your own local vicar, or you should, then he or she will be providing something. And it does give you an opportunity to look in on things at what you might call a higher level of church skills. You can listen to the Archbishop of Canterbury or doing a service, or some senior Methodist or Baptist or whatever. It does. There are opportunities to listen to things that you've never thought of before.
How do you think the congregations will find it at the moment, especially with Easter being such an important date in the sort of Christian calendar?
Yeah, they'll be sad, that they are and it's a weekend in which you probably have you may have some sort of service on Thursday, and then Good Friday service of some sort or another. And then on Sunday, quite possibly an early communion, an 8 o'clock in the morning communion, and then a service at its normal time. It's somewhat similar in Anglican churches, and certainly none of those will be happening in anything like their traditional form. We also used to come to think of it on Good Friday. Certainly not for the last couple of years, but for many years, we had a march through the town centre on Good Friday. Which started from the hospital chapel. It was churches of all denominations from churches in Ilford, and it was a march along the town centre, stopping at significant spots like the town hall, saying a prayer, singing the hymn, or some sort of Christian song going on. I think we went up as far as Green Lanes and then turned around and came back. But obviously, even if they were still happening, they couldn't happen this year.
Now, on a separate note, I believe you're also a member of the Valentine Singers.
Yes, indeed.
So how long have you been involved with them?
About 15 years, I think. I mean, I've always had a musical background in the sense that I have a grade 1 in piano and actually play the organ at the Methodist Church on Sundays, largely because there's no one else. I wish we had a proper organist, but my parents, certainly my mother, was very musical. Throughout my life, I've always been involved in some sort of singing, very often with quite small groups. Some 15 years ago, I joined the Valentine Singers, which is a somewhat bigger group. There are sort of 50, 60 of us, which I very much enjoy. We rehearse on Friday evenings and should, on pretty well the first weekend of the lockdown, have sung Beethoven's Mass in C, which we've been rehearsing for since Christmas.
Right.
But that was, of course, cancelled. And at the moment, we're having rehearsals on a Friday evening using Zoom, just like this. It sort of works. It's not perfect. It's strange. It's actually nice to see people's faces.
Hmm.
You can see the whole choir, and in actual fact, when you're singing in a choir, you actually don't see the other singers' faces because of the way that choirs are usually arranged.
Yeah.
You see the conductor, but you don't see anybody else. So it's nice to see people singing, and we don't get any feedback, because if you have people's voices singing back into Zoom, they cut out everything falls apart. So you're only singing to yourself, but it's still good practice. And hopefully we shall restart rehearsals, I don't know, next 3 or 4 weeks, something like. Well, we would have been on holiday over Easter in any case, but then we'll start again, basically preparing for our summer concert, which is a much collection of sort of lighter pieces of music. But hopefully we're going to get round to doing the Beethoven Mass at some point in the future. But that's not just the choir, because it involves 4 soloists and quite a large orchestra.
Right.
So getting them all back together again could be a major exercise for Christine Gwynn, our musical director.
We will look forward to, hopefully, once this lockdown and this troubled time has come to its end, being able to hear such things as the Valentine's Choir, as well as partaking in the open days of the chapel.
Yes, it would be good to see you. It's just as difficult letting people know about the choir as it is about the open days in the chapel. We have flyers and all sorts of things, and just hope we have a big regular audience, I suppose, but increasing it is always difficult. But hopefully we'll all come back in the not too distant future.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Martin. It's been absolutely lovely chatting with you.
It's a pleasure.
So stay safe and look after yourself.
Okay.